Emotional attachment is the most efficient form of control. The moment you need someone's approval, attention, or reassurance, you become governable. Your decisions shift from strategy to preservation. You hesitate, you negotiate with your own standards, and you fear losses that weaken you. Machiavelli understood that internal dependency is more dangerous than external enemies. An enemy may challenge you once, but emotional attachment challenges you daily. When you detach, hesitation dies. You think clearly, act without permission, and stop defending choices to protect feelings. You operate from position, not emotion. Here is the brutal truth. Humans do not manipulate strength. They manipulate attachment. They threaten abandonment, judgment, and disappointment because they know those threats work. They study what you crave, then weaponize it. And you submit because you want connection more than outcome. Detachment removes their leverage. When approval is irrelevant, emotional blackmail fails. When loss does not terrify you, control collapses. People become cautious because they cannot move someone who is not afraid to walk away. If you want the full breakdown, watch until the end. Comment unattached so I know who understands. Subscribe to Dark Psychology Blueprint, turn on notifications, and stay close. The next lesson explains how emotional independence turns every relationship into a strategic choice, not a cage. Attachment gives others leverage over your decisions. Human behavior is predictable when someone has something to lose. The moment you become emotionally attached to a person, label, outcome, or identity, you start making decisions to preserve that attachment rather than to advance your interests. You fear disruption more than stagnation. You tolerate disrespect because you fear losing the relationship. You stay in weak positions because you fear losing an image. Machiavelli understood that dependency collapses autonomy. A man who must keep something cannot move freely. He hesitates, second guesses, and bargains against himself. Attachment creates vulnerability because it gives another party influence over what you do, what you refuse, and what you tolerate. They do not need to use force. Your fear of loss becomes their instrument. So, why should another's mental leverage emerges wherever fear exists? If you fear abandonment, someone can threaten silence. If you fear judgment, someone can threaten reputation. If you fear loneliness, someone can ration connection. None of this requires explicit coercion. The attachment itself handles enforcement. People do not need to confront you directly. They simply withhold attention and allow your anxiety to complete the psychological work for them. You adjust your behavior, soften your standards, and moderate your ambitions to maintain emotional safety. This is why attachment is more efficient than domination. It turns the target into their own enforcer. They restrict themselves to keep comfort intact. No political authority could design a more reliable control system. Attachment also distorts evaluation. You stop assessing people based on performance, respect, or reciprocity. You assess them based on emotional memory. You excuse violations because of history. You rationalize imbalance because of hope. You prioritize potential over outcome. A Machiavellian mind never confuses emotional familiarity with value. Familiarity is proximity, not proof of loyalty, respect, or usefulness. Attachment replaces observation with fantasy. You see intentions instead of actions. You see what you want the relationship to be rather than what it is. This blindness is leverage. A person who is not examined will never be confronted, and a person who is never confronted will never change. In power dynamics, the one with less attachment always controls the frame. They can exit, negotiate, delay, or deny without emotional consequence. You cannot. Your fear becomes their negotiating advantage. They can demand more and offer less. They can disrespect without risk. They can replace you while you cling. When attachment governs your decisions, you are no longer choosing, you are preserving. Machiavelli's conclusion is simple. A person who cannot walk away is never free. Detachment is not emotional coldness, it is strategic sovereignty. You cannot control outcomes if someone else controls your fears. Fear of loss disappears, and clarity replaces anxiety. Fear distorts judgment. When you are afraid of losing a relationship, a reputation, or a narrative about yourself, you stop evaluating reality and start negotiating with insecurity. Anxiety becomes the lens, not logic. You interpret neutral actions as threats. You interpret distance as danger. You read silence as judgment. Your mind catastrophizes because it believes something essential is at risk. Machiavelli's principle is simple. A fearful mind cannot govern. You cannot think strategically when you are monitoring emotional stability. The moment detachment enters, fear dissolves. Loss becomes acceptable, which means scenarios can be evaluated without psychological distortion. You stop asking, "What if this disappears?" and start asking, "Does this deserve to stay?" That shift alone eliminates anxiety and creates clarity. Fear of loss is often irrational because it exaggerates consequences. People imagine that the end of an attachment means existential collapse, isolation, humiliation, failure. But when you detach, you learn that most losses are temporary inconveniences, not defining catastrophes. Someone leaving your life does not end your progress. A relationship ending does not erase your identity. A rejection does not diminish your competence. Without attachment, rejection becomes information instead of injury. It tells you where misalignment exists. It tells you where investment stops producing return. Anxiety evaporates because the unknown no longer controls you. Machiavelli would argue that once fear is neutralized, reality becomes measurable instead of emotional. Clarity also restructures priorities. When fear of loss dies, you begin making decisions based on standards rather than insecurity. You enforce boundaries because you do not fear retaliation. You decline obligations that drain you because you do not fear judgment. You evaluate relationships based on behavior rather than hope. You stop accepting apologies as currency and look for corrected conduct. Anxiety-driven thinking asks how to preserve connection. Clarity-driven thinking asks how to protect direction. This is how strategic minds operate. They eliminate variables that weaken performance. Emotional dependency is one such variable. Once removed, patterns become visible. Who benefits you? Who extracts from you? Who respects cost? Who responds only when threatened? Clarity exposes this without sentiment. The final outcome is internal sovereignty. When fear disappears, external influence disappears with it. No one can coerce you through abandonment. No one can steer you through disappointment. No one can bribe you through validation. You become someone who does not bluff against themselves. Decisions shrink to one metric: outcome. If something improves your position, you consider it. If it weakens you, you remove it. There is no emotional tribunal, no second guessing, no emotional ransom. Anxiety was the leash. Detachment cuts it. When the fear of losing something is gone, clarity becomes the only advisor left. And clarity is undefeated in power. Approval stops being currency. Approval functions as a marketplace. You provide behavior, compliance, and emotional labor, and in return, you hope others grant you acceptance. Most people never question this economy because they were conditioned from childhood to treat approval as psychological oxygen. They chase validation from authority, peers, and partners, believing approval determines worth. Machiavelli saw this clearly. Whoever needs approval can be controlled. If someone can shape your decisions by offering or withholding praise, you are not autonomous. You negotiate against your standards to maintain social reward. But when emotional attachment breaks, the approval economy collapses. You realize approval is optional, not essential. It becomes a cosmetic accessory rather than a governing force. You stop trading identity for applause. Approval is a behavioral incentive. People moderate their tone, expression, and boundaries to preserve likability. They avoid confrontation, delay decisions, and accept disadvantage because they fear social friction. That fear becomes currency others can use. A manipulator hints at disappointment, and behavior shifts. A peer questions your choices, and you soften. A partner implies withdrawal, and you concede. Approval dependence gives leverage to anyone willing to threaten reputation or affection. Detachment neutralizes that leverage. When you no longer convert praise into self-worth, emotional taxation ends. You stop responding to disapproval like a disciplinary tool. Criticism is processed for accuracy, not fear. Silence becomes irrelevant. Social opinion stops functioning as command. Without the psychological cost of approval, communication becomes honest. You say no without defending it. You present boundaries without apology. You exit situations that promise emotional cost and minimal return. You stop treating rejection as injury and begin treating it as selection. People who benefit from your compliance may call you difficult, arrogant, or cold, but those labels lose meaning because they were weapons designed for someone who cared. As the emotional reward disappears, the weapon fails. Machiavelli would say, influence belongs to those who cannot be shamed. Approval-driven individuals move for acceptance. Detachment-driven individuals move for outcome. Once approval stops being currency, value replaces audience. You pursue alignment instead of applause. You choose relationships based on reciprocal strength, not emotional theater. You measure loyalty through conduct, not compliments. You prefer respect to comfort and distance to irritation. People who stay must bring something tangible: integrity, competence, clarity, consistency. Those who relied on your approval add to action. Lose access because they never offered value. They offered flattery. You become selective, not needy. Scarcity increases perceived worth. Detachment shifts power from public perception to internal metrics. And at that point, approval is no longer worth trading for because you stopped being someone who needs to be purchased. Walking away becomes a weapon. Power is defined by options. The moment you can leave a situation without emotional collapse, you become unpredictable and therefore dangerous. People lose leverage over you because they cannot trap you with fear, guilt, or obligation. Walking away shifts the burden of uncertainty to the other party. They are forced to assess risk, recalculate incentives, and confront their own dependence. Most individuals rely on your reluctance to separate. They expect hesitation, emotional bargaining, and internal negotiation. When you detach, that hesitation disappears. You respond with decisive withdrawal rather than pleading. Machiavelli understood that absence can produce more influence than presence. When someone knows you will not cling to them, they lose the only mechanism that controlled you. Walking away also reorganizes psychological alliances. People instinctively respect what they cannot secure easily, and they resent what they believe is permanently available. When you refuse to compete for attention or tolerate instability, you signal that your acceptance must be earned. The dynamic reverses. Instead of you fearing their exit, they fear yours. Walking away is not abandonment, it is consequence. It forces the other side to decide whether they will adjust, improve, or disappear. If they adjust, you gain leverage. If they disappear, you identified non-value. Either outcome advances your position. Nice people cling. Strategic minds observe outcomes and remove liabilities. When walking away is easy, standards become enforceable. The threat of departure is more effective than confrontation because it bypasses argument. Debate is emotional. Withdrawal is structural. A person can deny wrongdoing, manipulate language, or distort memory, but they cannot ignore absence. They cannot negotiate with silence. A manipulator thrives on reaction, anger, pleading, persuasion, justification. Walking away denies them that currency. It gives them nothing to exploit. In Machiavellian terms, this is weaponized scarcity. You reduce access and increase demand. You eliminate the illusion that you can be convinced to stay through emotional pressure. Once they understand you cannot be moved by fear, they are forced to evaluate their own contributions, something most people avoid until consequence appears. The final advantage is psychological liberation. When walking away becomes natural, you stop viewing relationships as safety nets and start viewing them as exchanges. Value must be mutual, respect must be consistent, stability must be maintained. You no longer wait for people to change. You observe whether change happens without threats. If not, you exit. You stop sacrificing energy for narratives that promise improvement but never deliver. Walking away is not cruelty, it is self-allocation. The resource you protect is time, and time cannot be recovered. Machiavelli's conclusion is simple. A person who can leave at any moment owns every negotiation. A person who stays out of fear owns nothing. You stop negotiating against your own standards. When you are emotionally attached, your standards become flexible. Because you fear losing whatever you are attached to, you bend rules that protect you. You tolerate behavior you once rejected. You reinterpret disrespect as misunderstanding. You lower requirements to preserve connection. That is not patience. That is self-betrayal. Machiavelli would say a person who changes their principles for emotional comfort has no principles at all. Standards exist to filter access, protect resources, and maintain self-respect. When you negotiate them, you provide a blueprint for exploitation. Others learn that pressure works, guilt works, inconsistency works. Your values become a bargaining chip rather than a boundary. Emotional detachment ends this erosion. You stop treating standards as negotiable conditions and enforce them as non-negotiable rules. You no longer explain why you require respect, why you decline imbalance, or why you refuse chaos. You stop managing other people's reactions and start managing your environment. When you refuse to negotiate against your standards, you make others choose, adapt, or leave. That binary eliminates manipulation. It forces clarity. People who bring value adjust without complaint. People who brought entitlement disappear. In Machiavellian logic, standards are not moral gestures. They are leverage. They determine who deserves proximity. Negotiating against your standards also destroys judgment. When you justify allowing violations, you weaken your ability to evaluate behavior. You become invested in narratives instead of outcomes. You hope someone will improve because you fear losing them, and that hope becomes blindness. You become the advocate of the person harming you. You argue their case against your own interests. Detachment eliminates that emotional courtroom. You no longer defend someone's potential. You measure their behavior. You stop negotiating, almost. You stop rewarding intention without performance. You evaluate input and output like a strategist, not like a caretaker. That shift restores accuracy. The final advantage is structural consistency. Once your standards solidify, people know exactly what they must provide to remain in your world. There is no chaos, no emotional gambling, no trial and error manipulation. When standards are stable, you become stable. You stop wasting energy correcting violations because violations are not tolerated. The conversation is short: comply or exit. That is not cruelty, that is efficiency. Machiavelli would argue that a ruler survives not by pleasing subjects, but by enforcing order. In personal power, the same rule applies. The person who does not negotiate their standards governs themselves. The person who negotiates them becomes property of their attachments. You evaluate relationships based on value, not emotion. Emotion is an unreliable metric. It rewards familiarity, habit, and proximity rather than merit. When you rely on emotion to evaluate relationships, you confuse longevity with loyalty, affection with respect, and intensity with compatibility. You excuse behavior that damages you because you feel connected. You preserve relationships that drain you because you care. Machiavelli would call this sentimental governance. A ruler allocating resources based on comfort rather than emotional evaluation keeps liabilities close and pushes assets away. When attachment breaks, that emotional fog disappears. You begin asking a different set of questions. What does this person contribute? Do they respect cost? Are they consistent? Do they add stability or chaos? Power-minded individuals treat relationships like strategic alliances. Measurable, not mythologized. Value-based evaluation forces behavioral accountability. Anyone can claim affection, anyone can express enthusiasm, anyone can apologize. But value is demonstrated through conduct, follow-through, reciprocity, reliability, discretion, competence. Emotion excuses lapses in these areas. Value measures them. When emotion no longer dictates access, you stop tolerating one-sided arrangements. You stop giving loyalty to people who offer convenience, flattery, or entertainment. You start demanding productive exchange. This does not mean using people. It means eliminating relationships where you are used. It means recognizing that energy is finite and allocation determines strength. A relationship that weakens your direction is a threat, no matter how familiar it feels. Detachment removes fantasy projection. Emotion-driven individuals assign imaginary qualities to people: potential, moral superiority, hidden loyalty. They build narratives to justify persistence. Value-driven minds assess reality, not hypotheticals. They measure investment against return. They compare promises to performance. They track patterns instead of stories. When evaluation becomes objective, dependency collapses. You stop chasing people who never choose you. You stop rescuing people who never improve. You stop rewarding emotional instability as if it were authenticity. Machiavelli observed that alliances must be scrutinized continuously because advantage shifts. Emotion resists scrutiny. Strategy demands it. The final result is structural elevation. When you evaluate relationships based on value, your circle becomes smaller but sharper. Mediocrity exits. Opportunists exit. Emotional parasites exit. What remains are individuals who respect boundaries, offer clarity, and maintain consistency. Because that is the only way to remain in proximity. You replace sentimental loyalty with functional loyalty. You replace fear of abandonment with selective access. You replace emotional negotiation with strategic alignment. That shift is not coldness, it is governance. In Machiavellian terms, power belongs to the one who allocates resources without emotional impairment. Evaluating on value is not ruthless. It is the only rational method for survival. Silence becomes power because you don't need reassurance. Reassurance is a declaration of insecurity. The moment you seek constant confirmation, approval, praise, emotional safety, you declare that another person's perception dictates your stability. That gives them influence over your psychology. They can withhold validation and watch you unravel. They can distort tone and watch you panic. They can delay response and watch you interpret silence as threat. Machiavelli understood that reassurance is a supply line. Whoever controls it controls morale. When emotional attachment dissolves, you stop requiring reassurance, which means silence stops functioning as psychological pressure. You no longer interpret a delayed message as rejection or a neutral expression as disapproval. Silence becomes neutral data, not emotional trigger. That shift converts silence from a weakness into a governing tool. If you are unfazed by uncertainty, no one can steer you with it. Silence is also a screening mechanism. People reveal themselves when they cannot read you. Talkative individuals fill gaps to secure control. Manipulators escalate pressure when they cannot provoke a reaction. Insecure minds broadcast their fears, expectations, and emotional demands because silence forces them to sit with ambiguity. A person who needs reassurance will explain, justify, clarify, and beg for emotional alignment. They leak information, surrender boundaries, and expose vulnerabilities. A person who no longer needs reassurance withholds data. They do not clarify motives. They do not soften boundaries. They do not correct assumptions. In Machiavellian terms, silence shifts informational asymmetry. You learn everything while giving nothing. Whoever controls information controls negotiation. Silence removes emotional counterfeiting. Reassurance seekers accept flattery as evidence, promises as commitments, and sympathy as loyalty. Because they need emotional confirmation, they misinterpret language as security. Detachment eliminates that dependency. You no longer care how someone frames their intentions. You measure execution. You no longer require verbal comfort. You require behavioral consistency. Silence gives space for observation. It forces you to assess reality instead of narrative. It eliminates reactive responses and emotional bargaining. You let others reveal impatience, entitlement, or insecurity before you act. A person who cannot be rushed cannot be manipulated. Silence converts time into leverage. The final advantage is psychological intimidation. When reassurance disappears as a need, silence becomes deliberate. People become cautious around someone they cannot read. They moderate tone, adjust claims, and elevate respect because ambiguity forces discipline. They know emotional tactics will not work because you do not require emotional reward. Silence turns proximity into merit. People must earn clarity instead of demanding comfort. Machiavelli would call this the architecture of fear. Not theatrical fear, but structural uncertainty. A person who does not need reassurance does not fear disapproval. A person who does not fear disapproval cannot be controlled. Silence becomes authority because nothing threatens you. Self-respect becomes your primary source of stability. Most instability comes from outsourcing emotional security. When you rely on another person's approval, attention, or availability to stabilize your selfish permission, you create a dependency system. That system is fragile because external variables shift, moods change, loyalties drift, incentives evolve. Machiavelli recognized that power collapses when stability depends on external permission. Self-respect removes that volatility. You determine your value through standards, discipline, and autonomy. Instead of asking, "Do they still want me?" the question becomes, "Does this align with who I am?" That shift eliminates emotional turbulence. Your identity stops fluctuating in response to praise or withdrawal. You stop acting to preserve connection and start acting to preserve integrity. Stability becomes internal engineering, not social reward. Self-respect also fixes your decision-making. When emotional attachment governs choices, you compromise direction to maintain connection. You stay in roles that drain you. You maintain relationships that undermine you. You sacrifice principles to avoid confrontation. Self-respect dissolves that logic. It refuses to place comfort above consequence. If a situation devalues you, self-respect ends it. If a person undermines you, self-respect distances you. There is no emotional bargaining. There is no negotiation with standards. The decision matrix becomes binary. What strengthens you remains. What weakens you exits. Machiavelli would classify this as sovereignty, the ability to enforce internal law without seeking external approval. Self-respect also neutralizes emotional extortion. People exploit insecurity, not strength. They threaten abandonment to shape your behavior. They weaponize disappointment to control your choices. They exaggerate consequences to make you compliant. None of these tactics function against someone whose stability is internal. You cannot threaten a person with loneliness if solitude is acceptable. You cannot pressure someone with judgment if they do not depend on praise. You cannot ransom emotional access if they do not treat intimacy as salvation. Self-respect eliminates the hooks manipulators use. They lose strategic advantage because you do not fear discomfort. In political terms, self-respect becomes deterrence. Others know that pushing too far creates separation. The final effect is enduring power. Stability based on self-respect does not expire with circumstance. It is not dependent on trends, partnerships, or social validation. It becomes a permanent internal institution, unshakable because it was not granted externally. You become consistent because your identity is not for sale. You attract higher quality alliances because you demand reciprocity. You enforce boundaries without apology because principle ranks above appeasement. Machiavelli's calculus was direct. A ruler who governs himself cannot be ruled by others. When self-respect becomes your baseline, you are no longer negotiating for dignity. You are allocating proximity. Stability stops being a reward from others and becomes the infrastructure you live by. Detachment is not cruelty. It is the removal of leverage. Once people cannot influence your decisions through fear, guilt, approval, or fantasy, you stop being a participant in manipulation and become the architect of your own position. Power is not taken, it is reclaimed by refusing to negotiate your identity. The fewer attachments you need, the harder you are to govern. That is the entire advantage. If you stayed until the end, comment "no leverage" so I know who understood the calculation. Subscribe to Dark Psychology Blueprint, turn on notifications, and stay close. The next breakdown exposes how emotional neutrality turns every negotiation into a one-sided game.